Hello and good afternoon, and welcome to the session entitled Learning to Disrupt the White Racial Frame in an Industry Rooted in It. I'm Beth Kellar-Long, and I am the Vice President of Orchestra Administration for the Minnesota Orchestra, and I am the staff lead for our DEI work and our anti-racism work. I want to introduce you to the rest of the members of this panel. Lindsay, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Lindsay. I'm the Senior Web Manager at Minnesota Orchestra, and I co-lead one of the three anti-racist learning projects that we'll be talking about.
Thank you. And Emma?
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having us. I'm Emma Plehal. I'm the Communications Manager and Assistant Editor at the Minnesota Orchestra. And with Lindsay, I co-lead one of our anti-racist learning projects.
Thank you. And Justin?
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Justin Laing, and I serve as a consultant with the Minnesota Orchestra through my company, Hillombo.
Thanks, Justin. And I want to remind everyone, or tell you if this is your first time attending a session, that you can go to the ballroom for the Q&A section of this session, and you can upload your questions there into the chat. So I wanted to just start our session by giving a little context and background around what we'll share today about the Minnesota Orchestra's work to disrupt the white racial frame in our communications and marketing. And I wanted to start by just thinking about our theme, which is forging alliances. And I think that's so perfect for this work that we're doing because I first met Justin Laing at a Sphinx convening, the 2018 Sphinx convening, and we would not be here without that Sphinx convening and without Sphinx. And definitely an alliance was forged at that session, and such a happy result to have connected with Justin, to have him come on as a consultant with us over the past several years, and to help us arrive where we are in our work here. I wanted to let you know one acronym that you'll hear us use is AMELIA, and that stands for African, Middle Eastern, Latin, Indigenous, Asian. And early on when we were working, we used terms like people of color or BIPOC, and not everyone in the group that was working on this, and not everyone affected by the work in our organization could see themselves reflected in those terms. And so we ended up creating this new acronym that reflects global heritage more than skin color, but also recognizing that any term, of course, is unsatisfactory in that it groups people together on the basis of their non-whiteness and who they are not. So when we say AMELIA, what that means is African, Middle Eastern, Latin, Indigenous, Asian. So as I said, I want to give you just a little background and context. So in the 2019-20 season, we started working with Justin of Hillombo to think about how we might work to, ultimately where we landed was, our goal was to reduce our reliance on and reproduction of white privilege. And we worked with a smaller racial equity subcommittee and then our full DEI committee to create this plan. And the plan, and actually I realized we could go to the first slide here. The plan was created over the course of that, of the 1920 season, and ultimately consisted of 3 learning projects. And one was around organization-wide learning, and that was for our whole organization, so board, staff, and musicians. We called that learning project number 1. Learning project number 2 was around increasing our musical literacy in terms of AMELIA composers, so very focused on the musicians and the orchestra. And then learning project number 3, which is the one we're focusing on today, is about disrupting white privilege in our communications and marketing. And so that was more focused within the staff. And our intention was that the learning projects would intersect and inform and support each other. And just, again, thinking about collaboration and creating alliances, I was thinking that we had hosted a virtual lead cohort in June of 2020 when we were working on this, and we bounced some of these ideas off of that lead cohort and received some really valuable feedback, including how we were naming what ended up being called learning projects, because we were calling them experiments, and Justin will talk more about this out of the adaptive leadership framework. So we were calling them experiments in terms of like gathering data, which informs how the work evolves. And the feedback from the lead cohort was, it sounded like we weren't committed or sincere, or like, we'll give it a try, and if it doesn't work out, oh well, which was not where we were going with it. So we ended up calling them learning projects. So then the season of 2020-21 and into the fall of 21-22, we enacted the learning projects. And now for the 21-22 season, we've had the board has approved guiding principles for anti-racist decision-making, a strategic plan incorporating the Minnesota Orchestra's commitment to strive towards becoming an anti-racist organization. And our next steps will be operationalizing and institutionalizing these the learning projects and the anti-racist work throughout the organization. So just wanted to give you that little bit of background and context as we go into the specifics around the communications and marketing. Now I'm going to go ahead and pass this over to Justin to give a little more context and background before Emma and Lindsay dive in.
Okay, great, thanks. And we can go to the next slide. Okay, so Beth had mentioned this term experiments or learning projects, and we went with learning projects for the reasons that she said. And I also think, when it's predominantly white organization, the idea of experimenting in race can bring up a whole number of experiences. And so I think it makes a lot of sense to use the learning projects frame, but experiment might also be easier to translate. So I put them both there. And this comes, as Beth mentioned, out of the adaptive leadership model. And I'm going to just kind of go over one of the core ideas here in this slide, which is essentially that when you are looking at an adaptive problem, and that's a problem that actually requires a change in you yourself because you are part of the problem, that you have to adapt, you've got to make your own changes, that the only way to do that for an organization is for the organization, is for people to mobilize people and create a certain level of tension. And that there is that productive level of disequilibrium, that peach line there. And so that and I think when you hear Emma and Lindsay talk, they're going to maybe share some of the tension, some of the challenges, but you've got to create some tension in order to create attention. And so even from the beginning, using the frame of white privilege rather than diversity is an effort to create that level of attention versus maybe a less attention-grabbing word like diversity. Not that that word can't have its values, but in this model here, you are trying to create some disequilibrium disruption. And you want to stay in this peach section here, and there's a limit of tolerance. And I think even, as you get deeper into like adaptive leadership framings, one of the things is mapping an environment to see its political constituencies. And so I think here in the limit of tolerance, in an orchestra, you might have, maybe there's a certain section of musicians who don't like a framing of white privilege, don't agree white privilege exists. Or you might have another framing of stakeholders who also don't agree that white privilege exists, because this is a contested idea. So there's a limit of tolerance, but it's not just coming from the abstraction, it's coming from the way the political environment is organized. And then at the bottom here, this purple, there's a threshold of change. Now it has a threshold of tension. There's a minimum level to create a certain amount of tension. And that's where you're thinking like, okay, so what's going to actually be such a significant idea that people will come to the table? And you're trying to be able to stay on an issue for a long time. And so that's why you see this here, that you're trying to keep it in this peach section over time. It's called, they say, days of my life here, but also trying to have a level of challenge or disequilibrium over here. And the notion here is that in this peach area, it's productive, it's generative, that in the back and forth, other things will emerge and get unfolded. We'll have learning and develop. And hopefully we'll create an environment where people are teaching themselves in a variety of ways because they're experimenting and they're trying something new, and we don't know what's going to unfold. So that's the notion of idea of experiments or learning projects. Next slide. So what is framing? And I would say that, framing here is is the way in which we make meaning of our experiences. So when we go into any kind of environment, we're interpreting that environment in a certain kind of way. And you could say that when you go into read, again, as we're going to see some of the work that Emma and Lindsay have done, when you're reading a program, that is an effort to make meaning of the experience, right? And so framing helps people through the program, through the ways in which even I would say that like the conductor walks on stage, the clothes the musicians are wearing, all these are ways of making us make meaning of the experience. And framing says that, you know, you've got to think about reframing things, in this case here, to make white privilege, which is what we were working on, visible. And so we'll talk about that a bit, but that I think one of the things that you'll see is this is one element of making meaning, and there's lots of elements of that. But the text that Emma and Lindsay work on is one of the ways of making meaning. And then the last one, please. So why might framing matter to anti-racism? And I'll just read this one quote, which is from the White Racial Frame, Centuries of Racial Framing and Counterframing. And that's partly where this work came from, was the idea that one of the things that an organization does is it sits in a frame, meaning that it is a way of making meaning of experiences. And I would say when it comes to race, classical music is a big part of making meaning of what European people have to offer to the world. It's one of the ways. And our downtown with maybe the best facility and maybe the highest salaries and the most money in budgets, all these are ways of making meaning of like who are important people and what is the most important work. And so that is a frame. And then this here goes on to say that the accepted views of oppression of a particular group are easily blended with an ordinary bureaucratic frame, and thus to produce a view in oppressors' minds of that oppression being just a routine organizational operation of society. This blending makes it easier for such oppression to be rationalized. For the most part, large-scale systems of oppression are not carried out by wild-eyed extremists with major psychological disorders, but by ordinary people in daily routines. And so this idea here is that when you look at these experiments, and I think we'll hear, if you go back to that level of tension, just shifting and using frames like white privilege and stuff will cause some of that disruption, but it's trying to say that even those subtle framings that normalize privilege and make it invisible is its own form of oppression. But I would say that the other side of this quote that is not here is that you might have a term like subordination, but you also have superordination. And I would say classical music is more of the latter, more elevating a culture and how much you put that culture on par with others rather than in this hierarchical form that race does. And I think that Lindsay and Emma have some really great initial learnings in doing that work, and kick it to them.
Thanks, Justin. Yes, we'll go on to the next slide. So Lindsay and I are going to talk about really how these concepts have taken hold in the marketing and communications departments at Minnesota Orchestra, really for the last year and a half or so since this project initiated. And I'll just start. Thank you, Justin, for giving us some of that context. Justin's really encouraged us throughout this project to think about how we can show up each day in our individual roles at work and be disruptive in small ways that are both sustainable, thinking about that disequilibrium chart, but also deeply impactful and compounding over time. And so we'll kind of talk through some of that in the next few slides. So first, I just want to identify a couple more terms that you'll hear from me and Lindsay. And the first one is just when we say teams, we are referring to both the marketing and communications departments, which at Minnesota Orchestra are two different departments. So we're each in one of them. But we work together so much on so many things that we'll say teams often, and that's what we're referring to. And then when we say content, most of you will understand this if you work in the administrative side, but we're talking about anything on our website, concert descriptions, marketing brochures, press communications, program notes, social media, kind of covers a lot of ground. The examples we'll share today are really specific to some concert descriptions just because of time, but we do apply all of this work to a lot of different pieces of content. So on this first slide here, we'll go through it pretty fast. As Beth said, the goal of this project is really to disrupt white privilege in our communications and marketing. And throughout the course of the project, Lindsay and I revised indicators along the way as the project kind of took shape. But these indicators we've landed on are really just things to help us gauge progress. I don't say success because I feel like this is a never-ending project for those of us who are invested in the work, and we're never going to reach a point of completion. So these indicators helped us along the way to know if our teams were learning, if they were making changes. So you'll see things there about healthy tension within the department, holding ourselves accountable, embracing feedback when racism appears, things like that helped guide us along the way. So before we go to the next frames, we have a lot of materials that we'll share after this. I'm not sure how those will get distributed, but you'll get some of these frame definitions to have and to use in your own work later. So I'll cover them kind of briefly. But so when we didn't quite know when we started this project that there really was going to be kind of an arc of learning that took place, learning in action. And it really started first from conversations with Justin and his brother Alex at Hillombo to help us identify in our current copy and communications, where were the biases showing up? Where were these racist frames showing up that maybe we just hadn't even realized? There's a lot of things built into our style and our traditions and all of this that is really connected to white privilege, but we needed consultants, we needed that partnership to help us identify those things. Then as we begin to understand the frames better, understand the definitions, recognize them, we could start to integrate that into building new content that veered more towards the anti-racist side of the frames rather than the racist side. And through all of that, we also learned to build accountability systems and to support each other and challenge each other. And Lindsay will talk about that in a little bit. So I'm going to share a couple of copy examples. If you're someone who's worked in copy or communications in the orchestra industry, you'll probably know that we have these trends and these standards. And so some of this will look familiar. And I hope you can get a few ideas of how to maybe reevaluate your work when you go back to write your next set of copy. So we can go to the next slide. And there's a lot of words on this. I'll try to get through them quickly. But the first example here comes from a short concert description intended for use online or in a brochure, something with limited character count and for concert promotion. And while there's a lot of examples here we could talk about from an editing perspective, I want to hone in on one particular racist frame, which is color blindness. In this case, it shows up because I'll read the copy in a second. We've avoided mentioning race or racism in this copy at all. And I'm not implying we need to name racism in everything we write, but you'll see that in this case, it's problematic. And the anti-racist frame connected to color blindness is simply naming racism. So this concert was programmed to include a piece that would respond to the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis several months after that event had happened. And it was important for us to acknowledge the connection in the concert description, but we could have done a better job. So let me read this to you for those of you who might not be able to see the text on the screen. The description says, "Conversations of life, dreams, and friendships abound in this deeply heartfelt program. As Minneapolis continues to mourn the death of George Floyd, a moving work by Herbert remembers another life unjustly lost and offers empathy in Elegy in Memoriam Stephen Lawrence. Then two longtime friends share an intimate musical dialogue in a delightful double concerto by Bach, while Brahms' Third Symphony gives us all the gift of tranquility." So clearly we're trying to pack a lot of information in here in a short description about all of the works on this program. But let's get down to that frame. Sorry, was it? Okay. While we're trying to relate to our community and our city, first of all, this copy was written in a way that tries to speak from the collective voice of Minneapolis, and that's not what we should be doing. We should be speaking from our voice, from the orchestra. So you'll see that change when we read the revised version. Second, we really don't acknowledge what happened to George Floyd, and we don't name the racism that was involved in his death. And third, when talking about Stephen Lawrence, we also avoided naming racism. And if you're not familiar with Stephen Lawrence's story, he was a Black teenager who was murdered through an act of racial violence in London in 1993. while waiting for the bus home. And this piece was in memory of him. And so I recommend checking out that story in that piece. So there are some other issues at play here, including language around morality, idealism, and comfort in the orchestra experience, but we don't have time to get into all of them. So let's go to the next slide and look at a possible revised version. 8 months after the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, as the Minnesota Orchestra continues to reckon with the racial injustices in our community, this heartfelt concert opens with reflective music by Philip Herbert. His elegy in memoriam Stephen Lawrence remembers another life taken by racial violence in 1993. Then two longtime friends and colleagues share an intimate musical dialogue in a double concerto by Bach. Hopefully, you'll recognize that we're still telling the story of the music on the program, but we're not glossing over the true full stories that led to both the music on the program itself and the reasons behind the programming. And by naming racism in this way, we're moving more in a disruptive direction with our messaging while still informing the audience about this concert and what they might need to know about it. So I have one more example. It doesn't have a before and after, and I'll kind of explain why, but let's jump to the next slide and I'll read that example as well. This is just another concert description. The program opens with compelling and remarkable Sinfonietta No. 1 for strings, written in 1953 by an innovative 21-year-old Black American composer named Coleridge Taylor Perkinson. Then Bela Bartok's Declaration of Young Love shines through in his violin concerto, and Felix Mendelssohn's Vacation Memories are transformed into the sparkling Italian symphony. In this case, we wanted to bring attention to the work of Coleridge Taylor Perkinson and alert our audiences that this program is one of many that we're featuring music by an Amelia composer. And at first glance, that might make sense, but then you can stop to consider that we didn't racialize Bela Bartok as a white Hungarian or Felix Mendelssohn as a white Italian. And in doing so, we might be employing a racist frame of whiteness as norm, which is essentially a form of othering, is one way maybe to define it, in which the whiteness of the other composers on this program is just assumed because that's normal in classical music. And so if we're going to shift our language to disrupt the norm and to disrupt white privilege, we may need to consider, do we name their whiteness in this description? Do we not mention Coleridge Taylor Perkinson's? That's a separate conversation we could have. And I share this example because it's something that our teams have really discussed frequently throughout this whole project, and we're still grappling with it. And it's really come down to taking each individual piece of copy that we write and asking ourselves, who am I racializing? Why am I racializing them? And what am I assuming that readers know by making the choices that I'm making? And while there might be certain intent there, we have to really think about the opposite side of that and what might be happening just by the way that we're putting the words together. So a year later, as I look at both of these examples, there's still some places where I'd really make significant changes. And I think that speaks to the ongoing work that we're doing. This is not a finished project. So with that in mind, I'm going to pass it over to Lindsay, and she's going to explain a little bit about how we've created tools and built accountability within our teams in order to take on some of these conversations and to encourage making these disruptions a more regular part of our work.
Thank you, Emma. As Emma said, I'm going to focus more on kind of the learning component of this project. So in the beginning of these projects, we had an organization-wide learning workshop with Justin, and a piece of that was breaking into small discussion groups, specifically with our departments. And after the fact, we got a lot of feedback that breaking out into smaller groups with our departments was a really helpful approach for folks, because there was this familiarity with the context of each other's work that allowed the groups to kind of dig deeper into the questions that were posed for discussion. So we took that feedback, thought about it, reflected on it, and for Learning Project 3, ended up coming up with this idea of bi-weekly conversation space meetings, which were very much inspired by and modeled after the Anti-Racist Learning Group, which is also called Learning Project 1, which was intended for the marketing, communications, and audience service departments to come together for intentional, dedicated time to share examples, to discuss questions and or challenges that came up, as well as continue to do additional learning specific to our departmental work on top of the organizational learning. This really became a core piece of our approach for this learning project. I think the frequency and consistency of these conversations were really instrumental in our team's advancement of this work, and really getting comfortable, for lack of a better word, with talking about racism. As these conversations in this space progressed, we really continued to hear questions along the lines of, I understand the frames that Justin has provided and shared with us, but what do I do with these frames? Or how do I apply this to my role? So really kind of hearing from our colleagues, how am I supposed to bridge these concepts that I'm learning in these organizational learning spaces to my specific role and tasks that I have in this organization. So next slide, please. The outcome to these questions ended up being to create what we call this anti-racist reflection prompt postcard, which, side note, will be in the documents that are provided, that are shared afterwards. So our approach to this tool that we created was to really create or provide broad guiding questions that could be applicable to all different types of roles within our team. This allowed, instead of us kind of providing the answers and sort of shifting into that technical space instead of adaptive, this really put the responsibility on our colleagues to have that reflection moment themselves as they were creating or reviewing the content. We were also very intentional about what sort of the physical outcome of this tool ended up being. We wanted it designed. We ended up printing it and mailing it to every individual on our teams. And we wanted it a smaller size, so it ended up being a standard postcard size, very intentionally, so that our colleagues could put it up at their desk or throw it in their bag if they're commuting to and from the office still, things like that, in hopes of this being a tangible tool that's accessible and easy to get to for our colleagues, and not just another Word doc shared in their inbox or something thrown on Basecamp or something like that and forgotten about. Really hoping to be a useful, easy to access tool for our teammates, as well as just wanting to take advantage of our professional skills in marketing, communication, design, things like that, to create a practical tool to aid in applying anti-racism to our work. So next slide, please.
Lindsay, can I interrupt you for a second? Can you, just because it's kind of small, can you read what those prompts are on the postcard?
Sure, yeah, no problem. Sorry, I have to lean to read it myself. For what is being centered, what assumptions are being made, who or what are we trying to comfort or protect, Is there neutrality when talking about whiteness? What frames are at play here? And is a dialogue required to move forward? So I guess as long as I'm reading, oh, sorry. I don't know what happened to Emma.
Can we go back to bring the slides back up again?
Yeah, thank you.
We might have lost our tech for a moment. Well, so let's continue with the part after the postcard, and I'm sure Emma will be back in a moment.
Yeah, so if the slide comes up, the next slide has some examples, but really it was just kind of where do we go from here? A lot of challenging questions emerge over the course of the work this past year. Can we go to the next slide, please? There you go. Okay, so let me start over. Yeah, so where do we go from here? Again, a lot of challenging questions emerged over the course of this work over the last year, some of which in the moment we felt like we were unable to answer, explore, or face, kind of relating to the productive zone of disequilibrium that Justin was talking about, that peach area. Some of these at the time felt like the tension was, or discomfort was a little too high, where it kind of pushed past that threshold of that peach area. So as those kind of questions or instances came up, Emma and I documented those, so we didn't lose sight of those questions. So you'll see just a couple examples here on the slide. And as we are now continuing or starting the conversations of what's next for us as a team, as an organization, with our anti-racism work, we're really using a lot of these questions to help guide the evolution of this work and to help focus our learning as we move forward. Next slide, please. So just to share a couple examples of what some of these things look like. The first is continuing to distribute ownership across the organization, really making it a responsibility for each role within the organization to incorporate anti-racism into their work. The second being we're in the process of creating the marketing and communications work plan for the 2022-23 season, which is crazy to say. So really incorporating and integrating intentionally anti-racism priorities within that work plan. And then third, again, to that kind of idea of utilizing the skills that we have as marketers and communicators and designers to respond to some questions that arose this past year from colleagues, to create a toolkit that aims to equip our colleagues in communicating externally about our DEI and anti-racism projects, principles, and priorities.
Great. That is a very quick summary of a lot of work that has happened on this learning project. So I want to remind everyone who's listening and watching that you can go to the ballroom to upload questions in the chat. And we have had some questions that have come in, and a couple of people have asked, what's the definition of healthy tension? So that we said that was one of the indicators. A healthy tension arises around messaging shifts. So can you talk more about that? What is a healthy tension around that? Who wants to take that one?
Well, I mean, I'll say one thing. I think that, you kind of even think about these words as you listen to them, and I think another way of thinking of it as a productive level of tension. And I think the definition of that, I would say, is probably, what you're able to do before the political other kinds of groupings in your organization resist at such a high level, they'll shut it down. And I think systems are designed to live, and there's a certain point in which a system will do what it has to do so that it can continue. And so I think you have to find productive disruption. To me, I'm curious what other people think about it, is a level of disruption that can be maintained inside an organization, because I think we're talking about internal organizational strategies. And so that's how I think of it, but I'm curious what Lindsay, Beth, or Emma think of it.
Yeah, I agree. I would also add on kind of where that specific phrase healthy tension arose was towards the beginning of this work. Any large group of people, there's going to be, differing of opinions and thoughts and approaches and all of that. And that came up very early on where there was some tension, and it was really, I believe this is in one of our indicators. It was really for us in our work to not shy away from that, to expect it, to understand that it's going to occur, to be proactive about it, and not let it get in the way or interfere with us moving forward with the work.
I'll also add from my perspective that healthy, first of all, I think is a little bit of a subjective word. And I think Lindsay and I talked about that at times, like, is this the right phrasing for this? But I think that level of tension, what healthy tension is, can be different internally on our teams and communications and marketing, different from what it might be on an organization-wide level, different from what it might be externally. So in this case, that indicator was really for our internal working purposes, like in meetings with our colleagues in communications and marketing, as we identify a racist frame in something that maybe went out to the public and people are uncomfortable about it and are talking about it. That is that level of tension, like pushing us forward, like Justin says, in a productive way, or is it shutting us down and causing us to avoid this work forward? So I definitely think there are different definitions of what healthy tension looks like depending on the context. But in this case, this was really about, for me and Lindsay, how it fit with our colleagues directly involved in this project.
I guess I would add in there something that Justin said to me early on, which is that success is not no pushback, like no tension. That actually is not success, because then you're not making change. And so I think Justin's visual that he gave before is really helpful. There is that balance in there. You don't want to do too little because you want to create change, but you also want it to be able to continue. So I think that's an interesting thing, that balance.
I'll say one other thing about that too, which is I've been kind of thinking about reworking that image a bit. And I think one thing I would put up on the side of disruption and time on each of those is that the amount of disruption that you can create and the amount of time it takes is somewhat dependent on the larger political environment. So I think like Minneapolis is in a unique location, obviously, in the whole uprisings of 2020, et cetera. I think you can see in certain moments that things can happen very rapidly because the larger environment is becoming more disruptive, and it will make, by comparison, other things look not as disruptive. And I think now I'm hearing some people, colleagues who are working in philanthropy, and hearing some comments like, we're out of the summer of 2020, which could make disruption now become harder because the larger environment is switching. So I think it's also not, this level of tension is not just inside the organization. You have to always remember it sits itself in other larger contexts.
Yeah, thank you. We have a few questions wanting to know more about naming race in copy. So one about like what the example that you gave, Emma, about whiteness as norm, like what might you do how might you change that? Or like more about how have you found some solutions? Just some more thoughts about that. Where are you guys in your discussions and thoughts on that?
Yeah, I knew these questions would come up. The short answer is no, we have not found a solution. This is one of the biggest things that has come to our attention, that we haven't landed on a decision about how to move forward with it. And it's part of our ongoing plan in our teams to really sort this particular issue out. I would say, and this is not a fully anti-racist solution. In some of the shorter copy, we have strayed away from racializing anyone, which is still not quite doing justice to the issue, but it's at least trying to avoid the concept of othering. But that's for the very short copy when we're limited to character counts or word counts, and we just don't have enough space to do that without losing some of the other context of the description. But we are trying really hard in longer form copy, like full program notes and press releases and blogs, to not only talk about some of the racist history that may have excluded a composer or an artist from being in our awareness at this point. Like, we talk about that, but we also, when we're talking about a white composer, we might identify some of the things. We might first identify their race and then identify how that has given them an advantage, and sort of dig a little bit deeper into the context and the history of each person that we can, or each bigger picture that we can, when we have the ability to do so in longer form. It's not the solution. It's not the final answer. And if anybody has any thoughts on it, we would welcome a conversation on it, because we're grappling with it in every piece of copy.
Any more thoughts on that, Justin? Advice on that? No.
I mean, I guess one thing I'd say, I think, is, we talked about one of the frames being racialize everyone. I think, obviously naming whiteness is a destabilizing and tension creating experience because it's so normed. I think it would be quite disruptive to just have a year of racializing everyone. People would find it, I think, probably quite an experience. I mean, there's limits to everything, but I think it was striking, in that copy that you said what that would have looked like, just to make it comparison. It seems if you're going to do any, racializing Black people, Indigenous folks, so people can know they exist, but then every time that happens in that same paragraph, racializing the European people, so that at least whenever it happens, for everyone.
Okay. We've gotten a couple of questions about whether musicians are participating in these questions or in these discussions. Are these conversations happening with musicians and staff, or staff only? Lindsay or Emma, do you want to speak to that at all? And I can also speak to that a little bit, but do either of you want to mention in terms of it in the communications section?
Yeah, I think, Beth, you might have a more descriptive answer here, but a lot of these learning projects have been shared at various times in all board, staff, musician contexts. We've had several workshops, we've had several meetings. Our DEI committee is a combination of board, staff, and musicians, and so every month at those meetings, each of the learning projects is sharing some of these resources, including some of the examples. So, like, I've brought some of these copy examples to those meetings and workshops so that people outside of our teams have been able to see them and see what's happening. There are other departments in the orchestra, including the artistic and education department, that has asked for some of these resources and these examples to be shared with their staff members too, so that they can start to bring them into their work. So in some way, musicians and others are involved, but Beth, maybe you want to expand on that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, so I mentioned that we had 3 learning projects for this period of time, and one was around organization-wide learning, and that was for board, musicians, and staff. And then our second learning project was increasing our literacy in terms of Amelia composers. So obviously, the most musician participation has been in that increasing our musical literacy in terms of Amelia composers, and we devoted a week to that, a week of services, and had brought in 2 speakers, had rehearsals, and actually live recording sessions. And we could do a whole nother panel and session about that learning project. So musicians have been very involved in that. In terms of our other learning project, the organization-wide learning, as Emma said, our DEI committee is made up of musician staff and board. We also have monthly anti-racist learning group sessions, which is kind of a grassroots thing that started but has been become part of this work, and that is open to anyone who wants to attend in the organization, so board, musicians, and staff. I would say the musician participation varies. I think you're right that the staff get really focused in on this, and I think sometimes musicians are like, you know what, I'm going to play what I'm supposed to play, and let's stop talking so much, so that's another thing we've been talking about is each constituency perhaps needs a different approach in how we're learning and evolving and working on this in our organization. Justin, would you say anything more to that?
Yeah, this actually made me think about my brother Alex, who I wouldn't even be in this overall area if it weren't for my relationship with him. And he,
maybe you should say what he does or why.
I'm sorry, Alex Laing. I'm sorry, I imagine he's world renowned in my mind. Alex Laing is our principal clarinetist for the Phoenix Symphony, and my younger brother. But that he would frame that music is not just sound; it's also sounds, words, and people. And then we also looked this past year in our kind of study group process, our learning process, at this work from Christopher Small on musicking. And I think one of the things that Alex has, helped me to see, and I think musicking also helps, is to expand this idea of music beyond just the sounds on stage, but that the whole process actually is a kind of way that the audience is going to eventually experience it. And so I think it's not an answer to this, but that just wondering if, as this develops, whether or not the idea of music there might be more dialogue about what exactly musicking is.
Yeah. Another question that's coming in is, are we working with a group of stakeholders from non-dominant groups in looking at feedback and guidance? It says nonprofit marketing and communications is historically coded in white supremacy.
Yeah, I can start with this. Short answer, honestly, is no. We are, for the most part, we are a predominantly white organization. Our 2 teams are mine and Emma's teams, all identify as white. And this is something that has come up quite a bit, that, we acknowledge but haven't quite figured out, in the short term, what that looks like to include more of those voices. I will say, there's been times and moments either from our just individual network or professional network people, musicians and other organizations and things like that, that we've sort of run some of our work past, but in the large part, I would say there's a lot more for us to do in that, and it's definitely a top of mind area for our teams right now.
I'll add to that Justin and Alex have been really key in helping us even get off the ground with this, because of that place that we're at, because of how we are a primarily white group of people working on this. We needed that input from them to really identify our biases and help us understand what changes need to be made. From the communication side of things, we are trying to expand our list of program note annotators and freelance writers for our blog. and to hire a more diverse group of people for that content. So we are slowly adding people in there. And we haven't really talked about our audience services in this session, but they have been part of these conversation space group with us and some of the work on marketing communications teams, because they're kind of housed under the marketing department. And there's been some significant hiring changes made in that group because of the work that the organization has done. I wouldn't put it just on this project, but in bringing in a much more diverse group of individuals to help us continue the work and represent a bigger group for the orchestra.
Another question has come in. Do you also work with your education and community colleagues to support and amplify communications around your community-based work? And if so, what does that collaboration look like at your organization? So working with the education and engagement team in some of our, I think part of the issue is, COVID and what have we actually been doing in the time that this learning project has been evolving. So that might be part of the reason why we're pausing a moment to think about this.
I'll just add, Beth, about Michael. You all know much better than me, but just that I believe Michael's from this area. Hope I'm not going to be out on a limb here.
Right.
Good. Michael Massad. And so, one of the ways the experiments are created, constructed, so that they're led by different members of the staff. So while it was a different experiment, it influenced this one. And the idea too is the different experiments will inform one another. So the design of experiment number one, or learning project number one, was around this issue of learning and trying to become more literate around this concept of white privilege. And Michael was one of the co-leaders of that. And I definitely think we should shout out Hannah Lowney as well, like one of the original, as far as I understand it. When I got there, she was already there leading a group, a lunchtime group. Hope I have that right. Anyway, that group expanded and continued. And Michael was one of the co-leaders of this group of doing the learning. And so he's in that section of community education, I believe, or in that area. And then it informed this work because he brought forward this concept of musicking, the work from Christopher Small. So I just wanted to say that as one connection.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, for me, I'm not really involved in that part, so I can't. I think we are, but I can't speak to it personally. One example I want to give that I think relates to this question, it's not specifically around the education and community, but our development colleagues, they had some print piece, and there some folks from the marketing team was reviewing it, and one of my colleagues was reading, and something kind of like flagged, like, I can't remember exactly, but I'm interpreting this as this racist frame. How can I bring this up to that department? And it ended up, they did, and it was received really well, and they understood and ended up revising that content. But I think that speaks to very much the anti-racist learning group, or learning project one, of this organizational learning to create shared language and understanding of these definitions and concepts, to be able to have those types of conversations and stopgaps, I guess, in our work, to strive towards having it become more anti-racist and having those reflection moments as a team.
Yeah, I'll add one more thing too, kind of following back to what Justin said about Michael. Michael was a leader of one of the other learning projects, and is also a member of the education and community engagement department. And I think we've been really lucky, or I'm not sure how it all came to be, but our communications and marketing team generally edits or gives feedback on almost all of the materials that the education department puts out in the world. And the education department includes many of us in their conversations around pre-concert activities and young people's concerts, and some of the community support projects that the orchestra has taken on in the last couple of years. There's a lot of collaboration and cross-departmental work. And because in our case, like Lindsay and I are in marketing and communication side and in this learning project, and Michael is in the education side and leading a different learning project, and all of the learning project leaders meet together on occasion to share ideas. There's a lot of crossover and a lot of cross-checking of each other's work. And so I think there's probably a lot more we could do, but I think we've really developed a really integrated system so far in just supporting each other and holding each other accountable cross-departmentally.
Yes. So we're running out of time here, and I want to just let people who are listening know that the slides from this presentation will be shared in the ballroom chat, and also the link to the slides and other resources will be in the session description. So for example, that postcard that Lindsay and Emma mentioned, and other resources that helped to inform the work that was being done. So we just have a few minutes left here. So I just want to go to each of you to have you just share a takeaway with the audience, some closing thoughts here. So let's see, let's start with Lindsay.
Oh, takeaways from this project or from this discussion?
Whatever you would like, just something for them that they can maybe take away and apply with in their organization or the work they're doing, or something to just percolate on.
Yeah, I guess for myself and hopefully for those listening, the concept that Justin shared very early on of that productive zone of disequilibrium was really influential and impactful for me as one of those who was leading one of these learning projects. I think that the idea of finding that Goldilocks space of not too hot, not too cold, just right to disrupt and make change is really a helpful tool that I think people can use as they, strive to work to make change in their organizations as well.
All right, thank you, Emma.
Yeah, I think there's been a million takeaways from this project for me, but I think going all the way back to the very beginning of this session, when Beth mentioned that the general idea of all three of these projects and sort of the orchestra's goal right now is to reduce our reliance on and reproduction of white privilege. And for me, this project, this work has been a constant reminder that we can do that in our own roles. Sometimes I struggle a lot with being the person that communicates a program that I didn't design, and I don't always know the reasons behind it. And it's not, I guess all of this to say is that it's not just that we need to be anti-racist in programming. It's not just about who's on our staff and who's on our stage. There's a lot of ways that we can be anti-racist in how we write, in how we share photographs, in how we build a website. And we've talked about all of these different things in a lot more detail in the last year and a half through this project. And that's just been a really big takeaway for me, is that there is a role for us in this work, no matter what our position is within the organization.
Thanks. Justin.
Yeah, I guess I would say, one takeaway I think is just even all of the work that's happened. I think it began with Beth and then the organization, I think, being willing even to begin with the idea of white privilege, which I think was bold to begin with. So I think the idea, while I sometimes worry about leadership can become a term that then ends up having its own problems versus organizing, I really do think that's key, is being willing to take on challenging concepts at the very outset. So I'm grateful to be able to be in dialogue with the orchestra about this over this time. I think another thing I'd say from this conversation is I appreciated the comment about how you tested these ideas with community, and then also the link to community education. And so maybe there's potential to try to take those suggestions or that feedback and do something with it. But I think those are the two things I guess I would say from this conversation. And that's all.
Okay. And I would say my quick takeaway is that there is no set answer. And this is something Justin has helped me with. And I really want to give me the answer and we'll go do it. And there isn't an answer. We have to work through it and figure it out. And that's part of our learning projects. And so I want to encourage everyone to keep using that adaptive leadership framework, figuring out, trying things out, and knowing that there isn't a set answer. So thank you so much for coming to this session. I really want to thank Sphinx for hosting this convening, and specifically Afa and Abigail for taking us up on the suggestion to have this topic as part of the panel. So thank you all for attending, and enjoy the rest of your day and evening.